So tonight we're very fortunate to have Ben Bowen with us, who is from GreenSync, as you can see. He's had a long career in renewable energy in both the UK and here in Australia. And he's currently the delivery manager of virtual power plants projects, dealing with all the major electrical energy retailers. And in the UK, he was a solar project manager and put in the largest solar farm in the UK. So I think he's also pretty smart. He's got a degree in environmental science and a master's in sustainability.
Oh, they just give them out to anyone though, it's fine.
Yeah, all right. So he's very well qualified to talk to us tonight.
Thank you.
Enough for me, and I'll hand over. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much to Rob and Chris for the introduction and the Energy Transition Hub and Renew for inviting me down tonight. This should be, can you hear me now? Excellent, we're winning. So I say, my name is Ben Bowen. Please try to soldier through the Mancunian drawl that is coming out of my mouth. I've been in Australia for about 3.5 years now, and before that worked in renewable energy construction in the UK for 5 years, and before that recycling. So really all of my life, well, professional life anyway, has been spent in the renewable or the sustainability area, certainly. I'm here to speak on behalf of GreenSync and talk about the changes that may be needed and that we can put in place for, as I say, the grid of tomorrow, which is really around digitalization and decarbonization. Two very much watchwords that you will hear if you're on any kind of circuit or hear a lot of these talks or read a lot on this topic. GreenSync is a Melbourne-based company. We have offices over there in Flagstaff Gardens, just to the south. Very lucky to be housed there. This was founded about 10 years ago by Dr. Phil Blythe, who was late of this parish of the University of Melbourne. He traditionally worked in optimization of aeronautical energy engineering, making planes more efficient. That's what I should have said there. But he came to realize that instead of doing micro gains in efficiency in aeroplanes, there's much more efficiency that can be made every day when dealing with the grid as a larger role. So if there's sort of 6 takeaways here that I've thrown up that I'd like to cover off today. The first one, there's going to be quite a lot of graphs. So I am at a university. I hope you enjoy that. I've tried to make them all different colors and we'll see how we go. It might be a bit data heavy, but it will give you a big sense of where we're going and more importantly, where we've come from to get there. And that's often the problem. I have friends who say to me, but Ben, why don't we just put solar panels on every house we build? That would solve all the problems. I'm like, well, it might create different problems and solve some problems. And hopefully these graphs can help me speak to those. Controversially, I'm going to say the system the flexibility in the system that we need is already there. We already have an awful lot of flexibility behind the meter and in front of the meter, but it's very much about how we access that flexibility and how it is controlled and how it is managed. And that's one of the things that I'm going to be advocating today. Do not get me wrong, I would love us to build more renewable generation, and we should and will keep building more renewable generation. But the problem that GreenSync is trying to solve, and the problem that is being realized, particularly in South Australia last summer, is really around the lack of control of flexibility. Once again, going onto a more controversial topic, we believe that DER owners, so people with solar panels on their house, does anyone have solar panels on their house? A lot of you, awesome. Hopefully you'll agree with me then. If that is flexible, so they can do any kind of demand response with that rather than just feed-in tariff, GreenSync's belief is that you should be paid for that. Retailers earn more than enough money to be paying for that flexibility to support their baseload generation that they're getting at a flat rate. And that would create a market, which is something that I'm going to go on to speak about later. This, when you come to speak to economists and policymakers, is obviously quite concerning. But think of it as renting out the battery on your electric vehicle. You should still have income from that battery that you've bought and are renting back to the grid for whatever purposes it requires. Just because you are selling it back for them for a social good does not mean that you should not be reimbursed for the use of your asset that way. This is something that I work on. Oh, this is difficult. Yes, look at this, we're cooking now. Henry T. Ford obviously very, very famously said you can have any color car you want as long as it's in black. What we're finding is that that is very incorrect in all different ways, particularly around the Ford, because sooner or later they were rolling out cars in all different colors. But very importantly, his marketing team also hated him for that. People like choice, people like to bring their own device. If you think about mobile phones, traditionally 10 years ago, you used to buy a mobile phone with a contract and it was a handset. Look at that, in case I drop it. It's with comes with a contract. Now you buy data and you can bring your own asset and put that to it, your own phone. We're finding the same here in that distributed energy resources, particularly batteries, people are becoming smarter. They're researching what they buy earlier, and no one is going all Tesla. No one is going all LG Chem. No one is even going all Grid Edge, Schneider, SMA. There's a vast mix of assets that are going into the energy market, and that is being brought by people who buy assets. Who has a Fronius inverter? Who has an ABB inverter? No one. An SMA inverter? Yeah, there we go. So there, and I see people who they don't want to shout out a weird one. No? Okay. Any ones that I've not mentioned, but the idea is that there are many assets out there, and this is only going to grow. People are trying to find more and more smarter gadgets to put on your homes, and they should be allowed to bring you those efficiencies, and they shouldn't all be made by the same company. And therefore, that shouldn't prelude you from being part of any kind of market that would present you with money. Fifthly, while I'm not the most qualified person to speak about it, as I'm an engineer by trade, I strongly believe, and GreenSync are strongly finding, that markets alone won't be able to make a difference. When AEMO speak about this, they say, oh, the markets will solve it out, the markets will solve it out, the markets will sort it out. It will. What we find there is that it's the consumer that is suffering, and markets don't take into account low voltage engineering, particularly behind the meter. And therefore, a specialist market would need to be provided for behind the meter assets. Finally, as you can tell, and as I've said, I'm British, so to speak about Australian energy policy, I'm especially unqualified. I couldn't even vote in the recent election, much to my consternation. However, policy and guidance would be great. As I was saying earlier to Rob and Peter, Chris, so sorry, to Chris, what we've found, and that what you will see, is that Australia for energy startups is actually a really great playground because there's very little policy infrastructure or rules. We can try things like what we're doing, and that is fantastic, and that will get you to a certain point. You'll have very interesting conversations, develop very interesting software and solutions. However, none of us got into this just to do interesting solutions. You wanted to make a change, and it's one of the reasons why all of you are here tonight, is because it's not just about doing something interesting, about doing something on a larger scale that matters. Without a policy framework, whether that be Labour or Liberal, to work within, you're essentially stunting the growth, because being able to do 1,000 assets is fantastic, but we need to be talking about doing 1 million assets, and that takes governance. So policy framework would be great. We'll particularly look into the AER and AEMO to provide these. Okay, so to go back to what I was saying earlier, what we're talking about is going from traditionally a large-scale rotating machines generating electricity system, generally at a flat rate with a large scale of spare capacity. That is where the flexibility was, into a much more digital and much more flexible system. This is an example, obviously, of an industry that 50 years ago to now has gone through massive change, and it's been able to do it, and been able to do it with everyone bringing their own devices. It's not that there haven't been bumps on the way, but they have got there. So energy needs to do what communication has. Again, looking back, no one will be surprised by this graphs. Looking historically, particularly in Australia, a very, very, very large percentage of coal. But looking forward, we're looking at massive, massive growth in solar PV, both in solar farms, which is where my background is, and solar rooftops behind the meter stuff. On top of that, we're seeing massive growth in onshore wind. These are predicted by DNVGL. Try not to get too lost in the graphs. However, more macro flexibility is needed because, as we all know, and as anyone who is against renewables will tell you, but Ben, the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time. How do we provide that base load? The rebuttal to that is usually we don't need base load, we need flexibility. But these are fairly unique problems that we're having. And the takeaway is that by 2050, renewables will account for over 80% of global energy production. I don't think we'll get to that. But if you don't think that the problems will be significantly less at 60% than 80% when we're already having blackouts in the Mornington Peninsula and in South Australia in the last summer, then you aren't seeing the scale of the problem that we're facing. There is an absolute, as my friend in the communication team has done, a tidal wave of renewables coming towards us, and there are some very archaic grids that are in place to deliver them. So this is a very, very interesting graph. It's been around very prominently in the last year, source of course, AEMO. And what this is saying is that Australia is absolutely leading the way in the decentralisation of generation. A lot of this is because of your geography. You are spread out around the sides of a very large nation. On top of that, Australians have a fairly unique role in being, without being rude, a developed society in a very, very hot area of the country, of the nation. There's a lot of disposable income, so people can afford to, as seen here, put solar panels on their own houses, decentralize. This presents its own problems, of course. This is not to say that other nations aren't catching up. Of course, Germany this year went 3 days in a row off just solar generation, and they have a very different network to deal with because of the centralization of their workforce, of their population. It's a country about the size of New South Wales with a population far exceeding that of Australia. So it's that kind of problem that they're facing there. Okay, coming on to a more topical solution. Everyone loves Elon, or not, as it might be quite big, but electric vehicles will represent 55% of global car sales by 2050. That's not to say, as I was saying to Chris earlier, that won't be a large amount of internal combustion engines knocking around anyway. Our good friends in Norway are very proud to tell you that they have 24% electric vehicles at the moment, and that's only going to grow. But what you also find when you speak to them is because of the problem of charging, they also generally have a car for the week for the commute, which is a wonderful electric vehicle, but also a 4x4 for the weekend, just in case. Now they, of course, I'm being a little bit facetious there, it snows an awful lot in Norway. It's extremely cold. You need a backup 4x4. But this growth in electric vehicles presents not only a charging problem, but also a temporal problem. This is the equivalent of 4.5 to 5 residential batteries with wheels and mobile and being charged from different points of the grid on different nodes at different times. I'll come on to this later, but I'll speak to it now. Is everyone familiar with the concept of the duck curve caused by solar? No, excellent. Okay, good. Solar generation, of course, is being driven in home residences in Australia, whereby in the afternoon, grid load goes down because of the large amount of solar that's generating and no one's at home to use it. However, if you drive your car home in the evening and you're trying to charge it, there is no solar. So you are charging it up off the grid in the evening, doubling the load on the grid. If you then drive your car into central Melbourne, where there is high-rise parking, you call this high-rise parking, large-scale parking garages, very little solar charge points, very little infrastructure, more important than very little infrastructure, very difficult to put new infrastructure in place for cars to charge in the peak of the day, you're actually accentuating the two peaks by charging when you're at home and you've got your air conditioning on and you're watching television and you're making your dinner, and charging it in the morning when you're waking up, you're heating your house up, you are listening to the radio, you're having your toast. You are accentuating the problem without battery storage to support it, or a more integrated, flexible solution. The gentleman who shook his head, does that give you a good idea of? Thank you very much. Excellent. And this is a slide that was gifted to me by my CTO, and those of us who know CTOs, you do what your chief technology officer tells you, especially in a technology company. So what we're saying here is little bit links back to what I was saying earlier. A lot of the flexibility is already in place. The vast majority of devices that are going in now are already native Internet of Things. For example, to go back to our friend Elon, each Tesla battery pumps out back to Palo Alto in California 15 data streams on the second, every second, in perpetuity. The vast majority of inverters that you would put in your houses are you already have a portal to control them, especially if you're, SMA, have Sunny Boy, etc., etc. The key thing in that, though, is they could talk to each other if they knew what to say. We all have, majority of us have mobile phones in this room. I'd say probably all of us, but if we didn't all know each other's numbers and all speak the same languages, that can't be leveraged. You get to a point with what GreenSync do, which is a lot of the work that I do, is speak into these tech providers to try and have an open API whereby integrations can take place. And you get away from the monoculture of Henry T. Ford and into the heterogeneous DER take-up that we're seeing today, where the majority of residences choose their own and have their own choice of which brand, which language it speaks, and that has to be leveraged via local aggregation. If you don't have the platforms that speak to all these companies, and you can't, the only other option would be to put in a regulation to enforce that, as they've done in California. So there are other options.
So that covers refrigerators and air conditioners?
This would cover, yes, completely. So pool pumps, air conditioners. I won't be touching people's refrigerators personally, but you can do it. We did do a trial whereby we put the chillers in a supermarket that will remain nameless. We turned off the chillers and just kept the fans going for half an hour to try and target their peak demand, which is driven by the network. That was a very interesting trial across 35 supermarkets, and we weren't too successful in reducing the peak demand as much as we said, because there's a high risk. The supermarkets are extremely risk averse, and to try and, even with the smarts that the people here, smart people than me, will be able to tell you when that peak is. If you've only got that half an hour snapshot, it's very difficult. But what you can do with things like pool pumps, does anyone have a pool? Yes, man, yes. How many hours a day does your pool need to be pumping? Is it 8 usually?
It's supposed to be 9, doesn't it?
Oh, good, saving energy. About the same? 6 to 8. So when you do those 6 hours is up to you. Now, you should be doing those, in theory, you could do those 6 hours. If you're out of the house and your solar is generating, you would time it to be okay. 12 noon till 6 p.m. when I'm out. That's fantastic. Or you could do it overnight if you've got a flexible tariff. And knowing when, and that's great for you. But then if you start to ramp up thousands of pool pumps, you can do load shifting and say, okay, it's important for the network. Say they think there's going to be a large peak around 2 p.m. Why don't we pre-charge, if you like, or pre-pump the pools to the morning? And that's that kind of flexibility. Thank you very much for the question, Robin. Hi, of course. Internet of Things. So anything that's online. A lot of the smartwatches, phones, but as Robin said, pool pumps, air conditioners as well are probably, particular with the proliferation of Alexa and Google Home, etc. And Hive is very popular in the UK, where you can essentially not reduce people's comfort, but shift the comfort. So pre-cooling the house, pre-warming the house, trying to move load away from that peak dynamically. On top of that, if you have a single combination point, you're essentially saying, okay, instead of trying to, oh, I'm going to contract Chris's solar, or I'm going to contact Rob's battery, actually I'm going to contract his whole house and say for a certain price, the retailer can control that under certain conditions to reduce load on the grid. So that's another access point there. So this is a very wordy slide. I'm really sorry. I'll try and talk you through it. So this kind of goes from where we were to where we are to where we think we're going to be. And these are the three problems that I've been discussing. Rooftop PV, as we know, they have a massive amount of issues, particularly this is distributed network offices and independent sustainability officers have no visibility and limitation on export during these people. So what these mean is that those of us who don't have solar in the room, if they wanted solar, you would be allowed a connection of up to 5 kilowatts. That seems fair, or does it seem arbitrary? It's really very arbitrary. There's no reason why you couldn't have large solar arrays apart from those 1 or 2 years when something might happen on 1 or 2 days. Networks are extremely risk averse, and so much so that, for example, as I was saying to Chris earlier, SAPN in certain areas and Osgrid in others have started mandating on certain nodes, so think certain streets, where solar can no longer be installed. Because on those 1 or 2 days where you might have a chronic lack of clouds, there would be too much generation. That really seems unfair, especially for the people who have late to the party, who might have been renters and then new buyers, and they have a new home and they can see all the other houses on the street with solar. They should be allowed to install solar on their homes and should be as large as people want. This is for the social good. So if there was a mechanism whereby flexibility was possible, where you said, okay, I get 10 kilowatts, but if something goes wrong with the network can rather curtail that down to 5, or on those particular days, you just don't get to export. That seems a more fairer solution. That's a solution called a dynamic connection agreement, and it's something that we will start to return to. On top of this, you have the problem of aggregated storage. This generally doesn't seem like too much of a problem as an overview. More people using storage, more flexibility, happy days. However, you return to the problem with a lack of visibility. So if a network can't see what's going on, they can run into problems. For example, our good friends AGL down above Southern Cross, in an area of South Australia called Salisbury Plain, same as in the UK, had an installation of 1,000 Tesla batteries. They saw there was a storm coming. This was in 2017, and they pre-charged all those batteries. Pardon me, wasn't Tesla, it was SunVerge. Pardon me. Pre-charged all those batteries. That pre-charging of all the 1,000 times 5 is 5 megawatts. 5 megawatts of charging, unpredicted, on the grid in the evenings when everyone's at home using it, actually caused more damage to the grid. According to SAPN, pardon me, the network, as you say in the country, the network caused more damage to the network than the storm did in the end. And so that lack of visibility and planning and coordination between retailers and networks or system operators can cause large problems, and that would lead to putting up more poles and wires, which is what we're all trying to avoid. Finally, we get to the problem with electric vehicles, which is another, as I was saying to Chris again, these are problems that we look forward to having. These are nice problems to have to solve as a society. Too many electric vehicles. I hope none of you really thought I was going to come here and say there's going to be too many electric vehicles, guys. It's going to be a nightmare. It can cause a problem. There's 1 million electric vehicles in Australia by 2030. The issue there, as I've said, is that this is a temporal problem. This is a battery that moves. Your ability to charge it is not moved. It's very difficult for networks to plan a solution for that. Also, electric vehicle, Electric vehicle charging takes a massive amount of infrastructure to put in and a large amount of expense to put in. One of the ways that you can solve that is charging that more dynamically and at more times that is strategic for the grid. The locational changes are a problem, and that's what they're coming across in the UK, where we've accepted a tender to manage 7,000 charge points inside London. That's in the city of London alone. So that's the amount of infrastructure that would need to be put in for that nation. There are 8 million people in London. I'm not sure how many, half as many in Melbourne. I think 4,000 charge points that would need to be installed on the street. And that is the kind of problem that could be resolved with more flexibility or limited.
What are they doing in London to
At
overcome?
the moment, they are putting units on the local substations. So they have, think of a dynamic connection agreement, but at a network level. So they mean that they can temporarily increase load during peak periods, go into that hub. This is, of course, extremely expensive to do, but it is a nice problem to have, especially when I grew up in Salford, but we relocated to London quite early in my life. And I remember the air being thicker and smoggier. It has allowed them to make clean air a real thing in London. So it seems a good thing. Where they generate that load from, as we were discussing earlier, there is quite a bit of nuclear in the mix in the UK. That's a topic for discussion afterwards. I'm happy to speak about that kind of question, but I'm not going to draw myself into it on Greensync's behalf. Yes. Yes.
There's been a lot of conversations about actually having standalone titles. Solar, wind charge, battery storage, for solar vehicles, wherever possible, instead of trying to run them off the grid or keep them on. Is that still on the go? Is that still a possibility?
I think that's still a massive possibility, yes. What we see very commonly is large-scale car parks, whereby you have this, basically, if you can imagine a solar farm, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and the car parking spaces underneath. I worked on projects such as that in the UK. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to say we should get rid of or reduce electric vehicles. They just can cause issues, especially in a commuting society. You would get to that point of, you say, yeah, great, standalone just for electric vehicles, but how many you can get? About a megawatt per acre or 2 megawatts per hectare, probably. I'm going to struggle with my maths here, of land. Buying an area of land within even, 10 minutes tram ride from Melbourne of that size for essentially a solar farm with a car park underneath isn't really feasible unless we're going to, put it in Flagstaff Gardens. Oh, pardon me. Sorry, I totally. Let's not do that again. I misunderstood your question. You mean flash charging petrol stations? Yes, that's completely still going. There's another project. Again, I hate to keep referencing the UK, but it is what I know best, on the Great Northern Road on the M1, whereby there's flash charging, and in my opinion, it should be instituted here for such long journeys. It would deal as well with another point that I made earlier when I spoke to Chris about the ability to have flash charging in rural areas, extremely important, and you would get away from the sports utility vehicles being seen as a domain of the diesel generation only, or the petrol generation only. Sorry, distributed network operator. So this is essentially just think network, but for distributed energy resources. This will be fulfilled by networks in Australia. ISO, independent system operator. Don't worry about that. You don't have that here in Australia. This is for they have it in America and the national grid in the UK, although it's funny to say national and independent in the same sentence. It will be an independent system operator, so whereby the distribution system is owned and operated not by the network as they are here. It's just a completely different model, and we have to design our business around both of it. Sorry, I should have deleted that. Thank you very much for calling that out.
inverters just going to self-curtail?
Most inverters should self-curtail, yes, but we would like to get to the point where people aren't trying to dispatch that anyway as well. This is what I was talking about earlier, whereby we have gone, due to the increased operational demand in South Australia. What you can see here is, as we see the proliferation of solar over time, you get to the point where very soon the generation of solar will be affecting the frequency of the grid, whereby we're going to have to, the operational generation is so reduced that it can no longer modulate the grid frequency. This has led to things such as lack of reserve 1 and lack of reserve 2, which we call 3 or 4 times, whereby demand response events were called to reduce grid load. This was in December 2018. So this is a problem that's only seen to be growing as well.
Batteries can't fulfill that control.
Large scale free batteries could feasibly control that as well, but we would need many more, and they would need to be centrally controlled and operated. So the Hornsdale battery, and for example, the one that's going up in Townsville as well, where they have a similar level of problem, I know they're at different ends of your country, would be able to control that, but dropping large scale batteries in also gives no revenue or value to consumers. It just manages the grid, and it's very, very expensive. Yes.
Can't you take that load out of pumped hydro? That's just another battery, but that may be better than
Putting in more and more pumped hydro would be another option, but the opportunities for those projects is somewhat limited by geography. I do agree, we had a conversation about pumped hydro earlier. What I would say is that what we're trying to say is if we're seeing a proliferation of residential solutions anyway, it's arguably better to leverage that proliferation and pass value back to the owner. Yeah.
So that means using the household batteries.
That's what I'm going to come to, yes. Or household, also curtailing household solar, but yeah, yes. I agree. This should not be in here. Sorry, I'll get past that one. So this is a slightly more involved slide that is not very much fun, but this goes back to distributed system operators or distributed market operators. Having the know-how and the engineers on staff and the experience, they should be able to manage this network themselves. We do not believe in passing network operation over to a market or market operation over to network. A combined platform that would allow both to work together would be a solution, or a combined system. But ultimately, the ASX should do its own thing, and the networks should do their own thing in a coordinated way. This would lead to, we are seeing more and more orchestration, more and more dynamic strategies put in place by distribution system operators, but then you can get into the area where the networks are playing in the market, which is very, very difficult. So it would be preferred for a retailer to take on that role who are A, experienced in it, and B, at the end of the day, are the financially responsible market participant, the FRUMP, as Australians call it, one of my favorite acronyms. Yeah. So, is everyone familiar with the concept of a virtual power plant? No, excellent, good. So very traditionally, going way back in 2008, we had the concept of virtual power plants. You'll see GreenSync down here, and Bala out of Canada, Smart Grid Solutions out of the UK, AutoGrid out of California, Enenoc, currently now called LLX, for those of us who keep up with rebranding. Now, what a virtual power plant is something that I've delivered for several years now, is if Robin wants to work for a retailer or even an aggregator and wants to limit their exposure by reducing their load, at certain points they form a contract. They might form a contract with 2 or 3 individual people here with individual assets. These can be heated pool pumps, as you said. They can also be large-scale generators. They can also be, think big generators, think like 8 megawatt backup generators on the side of a hospital, that kind of thing. They can be water pumps, or they can be actually what we're going to do is we're going to go and talk to the local gold mine, and we're going to say, hey, if we give you enough notice on this day, can you stop generating? And they will say, yes, we can. How much are you going to pay me for that? And we can do a coordinated response. We can do a training day that day. We can do a stock take that day, counting all their gold. There is online platforms that can do this. Generally, what this involves is a widget that would sit on the end of it, a very smart piece of hardware, possibly made by some of our friends in Melbourne at Watches. GreenSync also had a stab at making our own. It wasn't terribly successful, because when you make your own stuff and you're a software company and you try and make hardware, you make it very expensive. So an integrated solution to other partners is preferred. Distributed network operators can also do this. This would be a network providing their own support. So in this case, you would say, hey, my name is Gemina and I am a network. And what I'm seeing is that on the Flemington substation, we want to do some upgrades. But unfortunately, while these upgrades are on, we're going to have to reduce capacity. I will launch a demand response program. Therefore, if I see this capacity increasing, I can ask the local businesses, for example, the racecourse, to curtail their load and switch to the backup generation they already had for a pretty penny, to mean that to allow us to upgrade that substation without rolling outages, or without having to roll in there with temporary backup generation, which no one wants in a residential area. This is something that we saw, oh, pardon me, this is something that we saw from 2008 and is starting to ramp down now. The reason it's ramping down is those widgets. They're very expensive and they were dumb. What we started to see was people, the widget makers or the technology providers, not fighting back, but realizing that these, particularly when you're looking at Tesla, Reposit, who are based out of Australia as well, and Jelly, who we don't see too much of in Australia, but are now largely moving a lot of their projects over to Europe, is that, okay, my name is Tesla and I build batteries. I'm really good at it. Everyone wants one. I know, why don't I build a platform called Grid Logic, whereby you, Energy Australia, can contract that platform and you can control all of the devices that your clients have that have a Tesla. So that you can do demand response using their own proprietary platforms. But then, as you've been saying, the Model T Ford thing again, he keeps going on about that. Doesn't that mean that you would need 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different demand response platforms, one for each technical provider? That is a problem that we've started to see. I mean, let's be honest, retailers can afford 3 or 4 or 5 different software licenses a year. They're very rich. They certainly make a lot of money. They could afford to do this. The unfortunate thing is they wouldn't be doing it in a coordinated way. And finally, what we're seeing is newer flexible markets. These are, here we're looking at Electron and this terribly printed icon here is a company called Piccolo. They're both based out of the UK and are companies that we are working with on that electric vehicle project that I mentioned earlier. You also have Power Ledger, who are based out of Western Australia and are doing a lot of work in the solar space. And Nodes, there's a Norwegian word that they are, but they're basically a Scandinavian provider here. And what we're saying here is what I spoke about actually at the start, whereby because of the need for this, we're seeing a lot of startups and we're seeing a lot of people come in and write complicated algorithms to manage this stuff. But the difficulty is the scale. As DERs grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, and you have 15 data streams coming from whether it be a Tesla or an auto grid solution or a Reposit, every second, on the second, the algorithms and the edge cases, those edge cases become more broader and become actual risks. So that's what we're finding there. So we need to operate at very, very high densities and very, very high flexibilities. There's a lot of proof of concept trials. What we're trying to do is take that further. Okay, so where are we getting to? This is the solution that GreenSync is backing. Why have they sent me here? Well, so what we're saying is this must be an open platform. It must be able for everyone. The key thing and the most important thing from an engineer's background is that it would be grid protecting and it would be managed at some point by the networks. Not operated by the networks, but would have network input and would allow the low-level voltage control to be visible to them. as it is their responsibility. You don't want to be changing anyone's responsibilities or making them change what they've done or where their skill level sets. Secondly, it needs to be market enabling. As I've said before, this is about bringing value to people, whether or not that be yourself or building a business case whereby actually it doesn't make sense for AGL to throw up another coal power plant. You get to that point where the amount of flexibility and demand and response means that you don't have to keep building out generation capacity. And finally, it would need to be middleware to work with all the existing BPPs, DERMs, DOMs, all the different systems that already work. People shouldn't have to choose one thing. A middleware platform should be just that, an API that sits between and works with existing virtual power plants, because they're already in place. You don't want to have to transition someone off something they've invested heavily in for and works for the solution that they've paid for because it doesn't fit the wider social good. What we're finding is that AEMO and the AER are coming later to the party. So if you're going to deliver a solution, it has to be a solution that fits as best you can with what's already there. Now that might require some work from these parties, but it should not require wholesale change for everybody. This is examples of where we're seeing it. Here you have 0.6% solar uptake in California, and more importantly, that the completion of Rule 21, which is the API interface of VPPs to their network. So they have visibility of what these virtual power plants are doing. California, I never really thought of it until now, but is a little bit like Australia in that it is extremely hot. It's a developed nation from an economic point of view, and the population is spread out along the coast. So here we have Hawaii. They have a 100% renewable target by 2045. Have the UK, where the deregulated market will target 70% of renewables. 40 is probably what I think it's going to get by 2050. It's a very, very ambitious target by the UK. In Norway, is third in the world for EV sales. Norway has a population 1/3, to say that word third again, the size of London. So they're absolutely hammering the EVs, and how they manage that on a changing grid with a very, very, very large reliance on renewables in Norway. It's very important to consider. As I said earlier, Germany has the largest solar deployment. Japan, 2.3 renewables, preparing for deregulation. That's the key thing. If you take away deregulation, the market needs to be augmented if possible to provide structure. You can't just keep the way you're going. Western Australia, 3% solar uptake, demanding mid-demand. South Australia, 4% solar uptake with 40,000 storage systems by 2020. Sorry, 90,000. There were 40,000 sold in the last year. So you can see the growth is very, very dramatic. Now, the vast majority of these are, although you can get AGL going and then saying, hey, we're going to provide 1,000 batteries, or Simply Energy, hey, we're going to do 1,200 batteries. The vast majority of these are provided by people putting their hand in their pocket and upgrading their homes to be more renewable, more sustainable, and give themselves more flexibility. Not integrated as yet, but you would say integrated to from their point of view, it is. They can log on to Google Home and see their stuff. It's just not integrated into the wider system. And that probably shouldn't be their problem. Like, you pay your demand fee on the side of your bill, probably about what, 40% of your bill's demand fee? Something like that. To ask someone to then integrate theirs into a platform is unfair. Okay.
Is Reposit, if you have a battery at home, can you go through Reposit and sell your power at peak? Your battery power at peak demand? Is that possible? In
peer-to-peer trading via Reposit. Yeah. I think if you have the Reposit hardware, yes. But if there's a agreement already in place. So Reposit, I believe, would have to have an agreement in place with the retailer who's willing to buy said battery as well. Yeah. So yes. Okay, so this is a slide about the benefits of a flexibility market could bring to Australia. As I said previously, creating dynamic export limitations on solar. Now, please bear with me. These are very much back of the cigarette packet maths, and not to be taken kind of at university in anyone's papers or anything like that without double checking. However, if you look at you would imagine that unlimited export on the restriction of the 200 megawatts of solar PV that's slated for install. If you looked at a very, very conservative 0.8 cents per kilowatt hour in the addition, so you say, okay, 200 megawatts of solar PV times the 0.8 is an increase. This is doubling the amount of solar that's being installed because you have unlimited unlimited connection. Thank you very much. Unlimited connection level and no constraints on connection, whereby, okay, instead of 5 kilowatts, you can do 10 kilowatts or you can do whatever, which is really good. In managing solar storage and dispatch, this is more edge case, really. This is based off Bloomberg Energy's prediction that 1 billion in solar storage fallout year on year. So if you had flexibility around frequency control, around demand response, around providing of network services, and you say 10%, that's a number that I've picked up, it would be 100 million. If you can increase that business case by value stacking, which is really one of the many buzzwords that you'll hear, you're looking at a 100 million increase. A 10% increase in value from the flexibility of being able to control storage as and when you need to. Avoiding of capital asset expenditure, less poles and wires. Again, going on Bloomberg Energy, 10 billion annual spend on capital works across Australia. So this kind of sinks into this, which is SAIDI is fancy for keeping the lights on. GreenSync, one of the things it's famous for is the Mornington Peninsula project, whereby during those heady days on the 25th of January, due to a network of demand response assets running down the feeder towards Sorrento, Rye and Rosebud, were able to keep the lights on. This was a deferral for that project alone of $30 million in upgrades over 10 years rather than over 3 years from the network. The vast, vast costs of putting in more poles and wires can be deferred using flexibility. And for this, we've assumed a very, very, very conservative 0.5% allowance rate, whereby it can be distributed over more years by leveraging flexible solutions of demand response. Finally, we're going to go back to our good friend Elon Musk and say, okay, 15 data streams per second on the second, every second. How much, what do you think he does with that? What do you think? Tell anyone, got any guesses? No? No. They don't do anything with it. They store it. They don't sell it. I wish they would. It would mean that it had value. Knowing people's usages, and pardon me, not knowing the location of usage and the pattern of usage could be sold back to the networks for a vast amount of profit. You are giving this data away for free anyway. If you can leverage that data and charge back 50% to the customers, this might be a little bit pie in the sky, but data, we're seeing that more and more data-driven revenue over time across Australia, across the world. If you have an integrated asset, especially if you have a Google Home or an Amazon Alexa, that is data that is given away for free and is not being rather leveraged by the network for visibility, for improvement, to see the mapping of where usage is, how usage is, why usage is, and it's not being leveraged by the people who own the data for value. So to come back, what kind of functionality will be needed for a grid, for a network? Or you would need key visibility. Networks currently don't have key visibility of distributed energy resources. They need the ability to mediate those assets as and when they're required. You would look for trading between people who already have virtual power plants and people who, like Reposit, already take part in virtual power plants, DERMS and energy management systems. Importantly, you'd require digital contracts. This takes too slow. What I was describing earlier, going out and talking to a large power station, going out and, pardon me, a large generator, going out and talking to a series of people, is too slow. It needs to be more dynamic and digital. And finally, and most importantly, low cost integration for DERs. If we haven't got visibility of the assets, all of this is moot. That is really the most important thing, is the integration via an open API for these assets so they can be visible to the network, to the market, and to the retailers if they're probably willing to pay for them. It's that valuable. So this is kind of what GreenSync has been working on for a series of time. over the last 3 years, the concepts of the distributed and decentralized energy exchange. We've obviously just received, those of you following the news, a very large amount of funding from ARENA and backed by the EER to run a series of proof of concept projects in Energy Queensland, South Australia, and Western Australia as well. So what we're trying to show with this infographic, as they're called, is that how all the different systems would work together. So networks would undertake constraint management, and this would give them the visibility that they require of the technology providers, where they are and how they are operating. Peer-to-peer trading, which is a buzzword that we come across all the time. We currently probably aren't there yet in Australia, but it's something that we need to deal with in the future. Building response and site energy management system is what I spent a lot of my time doing, going out to, say, anywhere from Star Casino over to Simcoa Mines in Western Australia and talking to the facility managers there. And if you think I look young now, try being, 28 and doing it when you've just got off the plane from Australia, from the UK to Australia, and explaining to an energy manager how your software is not going to mess with their facility management systems and integrate to their SCADA systems. Yeah, it's pretty brutal. But that doesn't mean that those people just can't sell that energy back to the decentralized energy exchange. They might be already taking part in a BPP program. Many of them already are. Those are the gold miners that I was talking about earlier, who already have all these backup systems with their backup generation that they're leveraging. The problem is, at the moment, is the network has no visibility. Home energy management systems, the proliferation of these is what we've discussed at the start, whether that be from the proliferation of electric vehicles, smart pool pumps, smart air conditioning, solar, batteries. The growth in these is massive. The value that can be leveraged from them by selling that information and that ability to retailers or networks is also massive. The importance is how the contracts take place. Traditionally, you would get into a position where you would share the cost of your battery with, say, Simply Energy, and they would cover 20% and do you a nice finance package, and they could use it for a number of cycles per year. None of this is needed. That's fine. But what happens when you've paid off that battery and you still want to be able to leverage that asset? You need to be able to float that asset for use somewhere and have a contract already in place, or digitalized contracts already in place, so that people are not taken advantage of. Which is key. Also, fleet managers, this is really talking about electric vehicles, which we've touched on earlier, and the visibility of that. So what is the decentralized energy exchange? The key thing is that it enables physical contracts. So all that experience that's generated with virtual power plants on contracting sites, contracting residences to take part in demand response events, is digitalized and formalized centrally so that it can be done dynamically. Secondly, it must enable multiple demand response markets. Thereby, you're not just doing demand response in playing the wholesale market or taking part in RERT. You're able to, in one place, look at the different value chains around FCAS, wholesale, RERT, and even see the effects of tariff arbitrage being undertaken at the residential level. A lot of this relates back to, but why, is because DEX would be larger than a marketplace. It also provides that vision of low-level energy consumption and low-voltage energy consumption that's necessary for the networks. So it's a twofold problem. It's not just about making money, it's also about providing visibility to the networks. And finally, is digital. We don't have an app that we can show you. This is middleware. People shouldn't be logging in and using DEX. DEX should be integrated to above and below. So from the networks, to provide visibility and constraints and control, they can use their own existing ADMS systems. That's why I do so much work with Schneider and GE. And also from above, the other existing VPP platforms, particularly think about Tesla's GridLogic, or switched in Storm Cloud, or AutoGrid, or TECO systems. proper middleware shouldn't be visible to anyone and therefore should be agnostic in passing through that information back and forth. There'll be 3 layers to this. Let's Connect, which is what is really the most important thing, is that it's an open access free API. You can go online to the GreenSync website and you can see the API hub whereby you can integrate your DER if you are a DER provider, and you can integrate into DEX. This has been done by providers such as SolarEdge, Tesla, what watches here locally in Australia, but also quite interestingly, Metering Dynamics, who are a metering provider. A lot of what I've talked about, and I'm going to go back on it now for a moment, is the leveraging of smart things. Traditional demand response is not worth forgetting, is someone turning off something when something happens, or doing something when something happens. That can just be turning that off. An integration with a meter provider allows that still to go on in an increasing flexible and digital marketplace. You're not just dynamically controlling batteries. Someone can still go and turn off a generator, or pardon me, turn off an asset and see the drop in load at the NIMI level, and that can be leveraged as well, which is really key. And we're really excited that Metering Dynamics, who provide the vast majority of metering for Queensland and a lot down here as well, we're happy to integrate to us. Secondly, this is DEX Vision. This is the integration layer for ADMS systems for networks. This has been undertaken with Evo Energy in Canberra, and also with Sappen and Western Power. This is the complete visibility down to the low level voltage of all those assets for the control and mediation of the network, so that the network not only can plan and think where it needs to upgrade, but also understand that things like dynamic connection agreements are possible with Vision. The key thing is providing people the information, particularly the networks, that they need to make the decisions, rather than coming in carte blanche and saying one rule to govern them all. Finally, DEX Markets would sit on top, and this will be the transaction layer between retailers and networks, or retailers and retailers for demand response assets. So a network would say, hey, we think that we would need, similar to the Vert now, 2 megawatts in this area, or voltage control in this area. Here is the nodal constraint that it is on. If you have assets on this, can you perform? To go back to my initial slide, to return back to that, the trends are startling. We are seeing a massive uptake in demand, distributed energy resources and demand, actually. And what we're seeing is that if no action, more poles and wires will need to be put in everywhere, and this cost will be passed back to the consumer. There's no 2 ways about that. What we're seeing is that we have the flexibility to do this already. As I said, there is a vast amount of static generation that can be curtailed flexibly, but also the continued uptake behind the meter. We're not saying that flexibility needs to be put in of more and more large solar farms, large wind farms. It needs to complement that, and that's the key thing. The 2 things go hand in hand: large scale generation and the flexibility to support that large scale generation. It's the only way that rather carbon will go down, or you can avoid the large scale dropping in of nuclear as we've done in the UK, which is not great in my opinion. As we showed by a show of hands earlier, not everyone has Tesla. One size does not fit all, and nor should it. I believe we're going to end up in a place where a energy tariff is similar to a phone tariff, whereby you'll be paying, I don't know, $2 a day, $3 a day, and it's all you can eat, similar to your phone tariff. And whether you use it or not is up to you. We're seeing some trials going in around that, in South Australia, whereby people were using $0.8 per day. Talking like on the graph now, 8 cents a day, but still happy to pay that $2 as that surety they can bring whatever they want to the system on those days when they go over. Doesn't matter. DER owners, as I've said, should get paid for their assets flexibility. It's vastly, vastly cheaper than going in and putting the poles and wires in place. And the vision that it provides them is of vast value, and the flexibility is of vast value to the networks and the retailers. And thus, the people who've, for the hard work to go and pay tax on their earnings, gone home and put another social good by providing solar and batteries to the grid, they should be rewarded. Markets won't hack it. It needs a combination of markets and networks. The low voltage physics absolutely matters, as shown, for example, by the South Australian example. And, absolutely not really qualified to it, but a policy. This is a Brit, and as an engineer, we do have policy people who can answer questions better than I can, but we believe that policy will be great too. Any kind of structure that we can work with, whether that be Labour or Liberal, would be preferable to the almost vacuum of policy that we're seeing now, just the gap of space whereby it's impossible to grow without a framework to grow into. And that's the kind of policy that we're looking to. That can be very conservative. I mean, don't get me wrong, I vastly hope it's not, but something to work with rather than just do it yourself for such a social problem would be very helpful. I'll read that out. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for having me.